Hello everybody. It is 2 o'clock Hong Kong time. I think different times in different places. My name is Renia Lopez. I work at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and I am presenting this talk today, not only on behalf of the university, but also on behalf of ISGS, International Society for Gesture Studies Hong Kong. Just before we start, very quickly, can everybody hear me and can everybody see us and the screen? So just give us a quick yes or no in the chat. So thank you very much. Okay, so we are going to be recording this session. Hopefully we will be able to make it available later on. So just so you know that we will be recording. Keep your microphones on mute, please. Otherwise, we will probably mute you. And if you have any questions throughout the talk, maybe make a note of them on the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the talk. So the idea is for Naomi to speak for about 50 minutes, and then we will have about 10 minutes of questions and answers. So, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. We are very lucky to start the semester with a fantastic scholar on gestures who I have been following for a very long time. She has done extensive work with other partners. So thank you very much, Professor Naomi Sweller. She works at the School of Psychological Sciences at Macquarie University in Australia, Sydney. And the reason why I am so interested in her work is that she touches upon the cognitive elements of gestures. She works both with children and adults, but she also collaborates with many of the scholars, including those in educational settings. So I'm hoping that this talk today would be useful to many of our MA students. I hope you guys are all here. And of course, gesture scholars in general. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we are recording, so hopefully this talk will be available later on. Not going to say anything else. Naomi, thank you so much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for such a welcoming introduction. That's lovely. So yes, I'm from the School of Psychological Sciences at Macquarie University. And the work I'm going to be presenting today is primarily with colleagues, including many current and ex-students of mine in the school. So I'm going to be talking through a program of research that I've had for coming up to about a decade now on why are gestures not always helpful. So quite often they are, we know they are, but I'm going to be talking about when they're helpful, when they're more or less helpful. And I'm going to be talking through different task factors, different types of gestures, and also individual differences, so individual characteristics that might influence gestures effects. I'm primarily going to be talking about narrative comprehension and recall. Those are the main tasks we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to be looking at two different aspects of gestures. So either observing gestures or producing gestures. So gestures, the hand movements that we make, we can either observe somebody else making them as we're learning a task, or we can produce them ourselves. So in the case of narrative comprehension, we could be watching a narrator who, as they are talking, is gesturing, or we could be producing the gestures ourselves as we learn that same content. So I'm going to talk through today when observing both observing and producing gestures might be helpful or not helpful, or differentially helpful. Okay, let's start with observing gestures, because this is what I started looking at first, with an interesting side note that I'll talk about when we get to producing gestures. But by and large, to begin with, I started observing gestures was my first interest. So we're going to start with some quite old research that I did and build the story from there. So we're going to talk through a series of studies and build up as we go. So this one's fairly old, as you can see. This was published in 2016. This was a study with preschoolers. So we had 4-year-olds, and we showed them some videos. It was a story about a little girl's trip to the park and going home afterwards. So quite a simple story and something that would be fairly familiar to them, to their day-to-day lives. So here's our narrator here. And he narrated in 4 different conditions. He either produced iconic gestures, so they were concrete gestures. So things like, at one point, he talked about driving a car, so he mimed driving a car. At one point, so that's for the iconic gestures. For the deictic gestures, he pointed at the car that was in the display at the same point. For the beat gestures, it was sort of a flicking movement, sort of like this. And in the 4th video, he produced no gestures at all. So the kids watched one of these 4 videos, and then we asked them to recall what happened in the story. So I'm going through this with a little bit of detail here because this is a sort of approach that I took in a lot of the studies, and so that I don't have to repeat all the methodology every time, because it's a very similar approach. So they watched the video in one of these 4 conditions, and then they were asked to recall what happened. So free recall first. So tell me everything that the little girl did during the story events. So that was what they did first. And then responses to some specific questions. And there were 2 types of specific questions. The first ones were ones that related to the content that the narrator had gestured during. So for example, driving the car or pointing to driving the car, and non-gesture content. So any other phrase that the narrator didn't gesture while he was reading out the story. Okay, and so this is the kind of basic approach that I've taken in a lot of the studies. So watching a narrative first, and then being asked questions later on free recall and responses to specific questions. So what I was interested in for this study is the different types of gestures. So our manipulation there is a type of gesture, iconic, so our concrete representations of either an action or an object, versus deictic, so pointing at something, versus a beat gesture, which doesn't have semantic content, but is like an emphasis, so like a flicking motion, for example, versus our control group of no gestures. Okay, so our research question here of does the type of gesture affect how beneficial the gestures might be? Overall, we found that yes, so iconic gestures and deictic gestures were both more beneficial than no gestures. So here's our free recall, iconic, better than no gesture, and deictic, better than no gesture. We got the same for the gesture questions. So here we've got iconic, better than no gesture, deictic, better than no gesture. And in this case, both of those were also better than beat gestures. No difference for the non-gesture questions. Okay, so this was the first study that I ran on the narrative comprehension sort of paradigm with some fairly straightforward results that iconic and deictic gestures were beneficial, beat gestures were not. So as we go, we're going to fill in our potential moderating factors for when gestures are sometimes helpful and sometimes not helpful. And so our first one to fill in here is that the gesture type is a potential moderating factor. So yes, the type of gesture that we are observing while we're learning can influence the extent to which we might learn the content being presented to us. So from there, I wanted to expand that a little bit further. I wanted to look a little bit more deeply into different subtypes of iconic gestures. So the next study, still working with preschoolers, we're just using iconic gestures now. So 2 different types of iconic gestures. The first type reinforced the content of the narrative, and the second type contradicted the content of the narrative. So for example, here, our narrator is gesturing 3, but what he is saying verbally is 1. So he's talking here, this is a narrative that I've used in quite a few of my studies. It's a narrative about Donald Duck, and in it, Donald Duck is attempting to water his prize-winning watermelon. So he's got watermelon garden, he's trying to get water out of a pump, and he's attempting to water the watermelons. And what's happening at this point in the narrative is that the narrator is saying that the watermelons had won first prize at the local fair. And so our reinforcing gesture there is, he says first prize, so 1, that reinforces it. Contradictory, he's gesturing 3, but he's still saying first prize. Okay, so we're moving now to looking at subtypes of our iconic gestures. So reinforcing versus contradictory iconic gestures. What we found here was there was no significant effect for free recall and no significant effect for non-gesture questions. But for our gesture questions, the reinforcing gestures were significantly better than no gestures. There were no other significant differences. So basically here what we've got is that observing the reinforcing gestures significantly benefited narrative comprehension beyond when no gestures were observed. But observing contradictory gestures was neither significantly beneficial nor was it detrimental to our narrative recall here. Okay, so the reinforcing was helpful. The contradictory did nothing, which was actually a surprise to me. I was expecting that if there was something different coming out of the narrator's mouth, what he was saying versus what he was gesturing, that would be detrimental, but it wasn't. It looks like people just filtered out that contradictory gesture information. So we can fill in our second potential moderating factor here. So we've said that iconic gestures are beneficial, but within that, there's a difference between the type of iconic gesture. So reinforcing ones are helpful, contradictory ones did nothing. Okay, so then getting even more fine-grained within reinforcing iconic gestures, are there different types within there? I wanted to look at, are all reinforcing iconic gestures sort of, well, let me rephrase that. They're not homogeneous. They're not all the same. I wanted to look at whether there were differences between maybe how typical the gestures that are produced are. So what we did was we wanted to find out what were the more commonly produced gestures. So we had adults and children watch the original Donald Duck cartoon. So here's him, Donald, trying to get water out of the pump into the bucket to water his prize-winning watermelons. So they watched the video rather than watching a narrator. So this time they're watching the video, the actual cartoon. They're watching the cartoon. And we then asked them to relate the cartoon back to us. And we just wrote down the gestures that they produced at a very sort of macro level of just, we're not coding for any specific forms, hand forms or anything, just basically what were they depicting. And we were able to come up with typical gestures, which many people produced, versus atypical gestures, which they didn't. So the one that we're showing here, this is the point in the cartoon. We've got Donald Duck using the pump. And when participants reported that Donald Duck was pumping water, most of them did this. They're pumping water. It doesn't quite mirror exactly the way Donald has his hands in the cartoon, but it's sort of typically how we, at least in English-speaking countries, are thinking of pumping. So lots of people did this. So this became our typical gesture. Excuse the fuzziness there. That's me taking screenshots out of a moving video. So this is the typical gesture. The atypical gesture is depicting the movement of the pump, but not Donald himself pumping it. So it's still depicting the same phrase of moving the pump up and down, but not many people, or if any, produced that gesture. So they watched the cartoon, they were asked to relay the content, and we came up with a series of commonly produced typical gestures and uncommonly produced atypical gestures. We then used those gestures for the same sort of study as we just talked about before. So we're manipulating the subtype of the reinforcing gestures, and we're looking at whether there were differential effects of observing the typical and atypical gestures. There's a lot going on this slide, so I'll talk you through it slowly. So we had people watching typical gestures, atypical gestures, or no gestures. We also thought, well, will we have differential effects if we make the task harder? So we also manipulated the word frequency. So we had high frequency words and low frequency words. So in addition to manipulating the gestures, we manipulated what the narrator said verbally. And so we simply swapped out some words from the narrative with either more high frequency words, which we thought would be easier, or more low frequency words, which we thought would be harder. The data that I've got here are for the specific questions relating to the gesture questions. So the gesture, the points at which the narrator gestured in the narrative. We have a similar pattern seen for free recall. So we've got a main effective gesture condition. Recall on the gesture items was significantly higher for the typical gesture condition than both the no gesture and the atypical gesture condition. Okay, so we've got typical was better than atypical, and typical was also better than no gesture, but no difference between the atypical and the no gesture. So what we've got here is, remember what we looked at before where contradictory gestures did nothing? We've also now got reinforcing but atypical gestures doing nothing. So the only ones that are actually helpful are those ones that we commonly produce. Okay, so if it's contradictory, it does nothing. If it's reinforcing, but perhaps not what you would initially, I guess your first intuitive gesture, it's also doing nothing in this case. We also had a main effect of word frequency, in that high frequency was recalled better than low frequency. The interaction was not significant. Essentially, though, the participants learned more from the typical gestures than the atypical gestures. The typical ones were beneficial, the atypical ones were not. Okay, so we got the main effect of frequency, but that's not perhaps the most ecologically valid manipulation to tap into task difficulty. We very rarely hear narratives in which suddenly within the narrative, there's all of a sudden a much more complex or low frequency word within there. So we thought, all right, we got to try something different. So first, before we move on to trying something different, we can add our reinforcing iconic gesture subtypes of typical and atypical to our potential moderating factors for when gestures may or may not be helpful. We're not going to draw any conclusions here yet about task difficulty though, because as I said, that might not be the most ecologically valid measure. So we tried again with a different task. So we tried again to manipulate task difficulty. This time what we did was we added a dual task. So we've got the same thing. We've got our same three between subjects gesture conditions. We've got typical gestures, atypical gestures, and no gestures. And we've now we manipulated task difficulty with our dual task of articulatory suppression. So we had either a simple dual task. While watching the video, the participants were asked to say rah, rah, rah over and over while they were watching the videos. That was our simple dual task. And our complex dual task, that differed. We had both adult and child participants here, and that differed for our adult and child participants. The adults had to say over and over again, dog, fish, bird, dog, fish, bird, dog, fish, bird, whereas our children said dog, fish, dog, fish, dog, fish. Specifically, the differences between adults and children was not our focus here, but in the interest of full experimental description here, that was what they were doing. Okay, so this was again during encoding that they had this articulatory suppression, that we had our dual task over the top of watching the narratives. Okay, so what did we find? Well, for free recall, we found that adults did better than children. No great surprises there, but there was no effect of gesture condition or of task difficulty. For our specific gesture questions, though, we found that the typical gestures were better than no gestures, as we got before. Typical gestures were again better than the atypical gestures, same as we got before. There was no effective task difficulty, so the articulatory suppression didn't work. And again, adults were better than children. For our non-gesture questions, so this is our questions relating to points in the narrative that participants did not, that the narrator did not gesture at. We actually had an interaction between gesture condition and age group. So we've got typical better than no gesture for children, but not for adults. Now, this is an interesting one because remember, these are actually points in the narrative that there were no gestures produced. So it looks there like the gestures, the beneficial effect of having the gestures there is generalizing to more of the narrative than simply the points that the gestures accompanied. So what we've got here is that typical gestures benefited learning of both our specific questions and our non-gesture questions, albeit only for children, for the non-gesture questions. But why? Why do the typical gestures, why are they more beneficial than the atypical gestures? Is it because they capture our attention more? Is it because they're more semantically related to the speech than the atypical gestures? Now, many of us here are familiar with the world of academic publishing. So just in coming clean here, thinking about whether or not it's because of attention was not my idea. This was a reviewer who suggested this. So they asked us, well, okay, are the typical gestures capturing attention more? They asked us to measure head turns. So what we should have done if we'd thought about this beforehand was done some eye tracking and looked at where the participants were looking. However, like I said, this wasn't my idea, so we hadn't done the eye tracking beforehand. But we could look back at the videos because we had videoed the participants while they themselves were watching the videos, and we could count their head turns away. We found no, it wasn't due to attention. The children turned their heads away from the videos more than the adults did, but there were no other differences. It wasn't due to the typical atypical gesture difference was not due to attention. They weren't turning their heads away more often for the atypical than the typical. But what we did was we ran a second study comparing the semantic relatedness. So this was just adults because this is too difficult a question for children to answer. We basically showed them all the phrases that the gestures accompanied, and we showed them the gestures, and we asked to what extent that gesture represents that word. So for example, we asked, how much does this gesture represent first prize, as in one of them had won first prize at a local fair. Okay, so first prize, that's technically two words, isn't it? Never mind. How much does this gesture represent first prize? So the word, the target word that we're looking at, as in the phrase, so the larger phrase that it sat within, as in one of them won first prize at a local fair. And we found that yes, actually, the typical gestures were rated as more semantically related to the phrase than were the atypical gestures. So what we can add to our list here now is that the semantic relatedness to speech, yep, typical gestures are more semantically related to speech than atypical gestures, so we can add that to our list as a potential moderating factor for why sometimes gestures are more beneficial than others. So what that's telling us is if we are doing a study looking at gesture observation, we have to be really, really careful in designing our gestures. Because if we design gestures that perhaps are less semantically related than we think they are, we're unlikely to get an effect. Okay, but they don't differentially capture attention. So we currently don't have any evidence for attention being a moderating factor there, at least not with the tasks that I'm looking at. Perhaps another moderating factor, though, is the extent to which an observed gesture adds information to the speech content. So we've talked about semantic relatedness, but what if it actually provides additional information? So far, the gestures that we've been looking at they overlapped with the speech. They didn't provide any additional information. So if I say first prize, me doing this is not giving you any additional information. So next study, we looked at additional versus overlapping information. This one's just with adults. We did all typical iconic gestures now. We no atypical gestures in this experiment. So we had a typical iconic gesture condition and a no gesture condition. We then manipulated the narrative again in that some of it had missing information and sometimes no missing information. So for example, this is our pumping gesture again that I showed you before. So pumping water. And that would be accompanied by the phrase either when Donald Duck first got water out using a lever versus when Donald Duck first pumped water out using a lever. So they're both showing the same thing, but pumped water is a bit more specific than got water out. So the gesture's providing a little bit more information. It's not that you can't understand it without the gesture, but it's more general, it's less specific. There were no effects for free recall. So again, I'm not going with same manipulation that we talked about, not manipulation, sorry, measures that we talked about before. So same procedure here, free recall, then specific questions. No significant effect for free recall. But for the specific questions, we got a significant interaction between our gesture and our information conditions. And so what we got there was that participants did better in the gesture condition than the no gesture condition when there was missing verbal information. When there was no missing verbal information and no additional information was provided, there was no difference between the groups, which actually, if you think carefully about it, slightly contradicts my previous studies where the typical gestures were beneficial. But nevertheless, in this case, they weren't, unless there was missing verbal information. Okay, so then we can add the extent to which the gestures might be providing additional information, or in this case, compensating for missing information to our list of potential moderators. So just to take stock of where we are so far, we've looked so far at very task-specific factors, so things that we manipulated. Yeah, so we can manipulate the type of gesture. Within that, subtypes of gestures, we can add a dual task. We can change the narrative so that we're looking for missing information. Sorry, not looking for, manipulating the extent to which there is missing information. So these are things that we've manipulated that might moderate gestures' effects on narrative recall. But let's move on to look at some individual differences. So a task might be difficult for different reasons. A task might be difficult either because of aspects of the task itself. So that's what we've been talking about so far, things that we changed in the task, or a task might be difficult because of aspects of the participants, of the individuals themselves. Okay, so there's two things going on there. Task difficulty due to things that we manipulate and task difficulty due to individual differences. So what I wanted to look at in this study was when and for whom are gestures beneficial? Are they differentially beneficial for different people because of their own characteristics rather than the characteristics of the task itself? So we had all adults in this study, same Donald Duck narrative, which you're all going to be sick of by the end of this. And we did have atypical gestures in this one as well. So typical gestures, atypical gestures, and no gestures. We also tried a different approach to task difficulty by looking at interference. So that was whether there was background noise overlaid over the narrative or not. And then the bit that I'm particularly interested in here is the individual differences. We had a few different measures of cognitive ability. The one that we're going to look at now that gave us the most interesting results was nonverbal memory. We used the Ray complex figure task, just if people are familiar with that one. Basically, it's a complex line drawing that people are shown, and it's then taken away, and they're asked to remember it. I'm sorry, by remember it, I mean redraw it, and they're rated on how well they can redraw it. So it's a measure of nonverbal memory, and this is a standard measure that's often used in neuropsychological testing. Okay, so like I said, two different reasons that a task could be difficult, things that we manipulate, so the extent to which we provide support with gestures, or the extent to which we might interfere with the task, so our background noise versus no background noise, interference versus no interference. And the second thing being individual differences, so the extent to which participants might themselves bring their own characteristics that might change how hard they find a task. Okay, let's talk through this one. There's a lot going on here too. We got a significant three-way interaction between gesture condition, interference condition, and our nonverbal memory. I've got delayed nonverbal memory up on the screen here. We had a similar pattern for immediate nonverbal memory, which became non-significant after a Bonferroni adjustment, which are details that you really don't want to know. But if you do want them, they're all in the paper. So we'll just focus here for the moment on the delayed nonverbal memory. So that's the Ray complex figure that they saw. They had to redraw it after a delay. Okay, so that's all that delayed nonverbal memory means. So there's a delay between when they initially saw it and then when they redrew it later. So in the left-hand panel here, we've got our interference condition, and in the right-hand panel, our no interference condition. In the interference condition, at 1 standard deviation below the mean for nonverbal memory and at the mean for nonverbal memory, our typical gesture condition outperformed our atypical and no gesture conditions. Okay, but there's no difference for our no interference condition. Okay, at 1 standard deviation above the mean, there's no difference for either our interference or no interference condition. Okay, so our three-way interactions coming because for the interference condition only, for those who are either low or average on nonverbal memory, the typical gesture condition performed better than the atypical and the no gesture condition. So that's where the interaction's coming from. So what does that mean? That basically means that observing typical gestures benefited our narrative recall compared to the atypical and the no gestures. The typical gestures were more beneficial when the task was more difficult. So in other words, for the interference condition, but only for individuals with poorer nonverbal memory. So again, when the task was more difficult, but because of who they were, what were the characteristics they brought with them. So the typical gestures were beneficial, but only when we made the task harder with the interference and only when they had lower nonverbal memory coming in into the study. So this suggests that it's not just the type of iconic gesture that the participants observe that might impact the extent to which the gestures are beneficial, which is what we saw in the previous studies, but also that gestures might be more beneficial for more difficult tasks, okay? For more difficult tasks that we make more difficult and for tasks that someone themselves might find more difficult because of their individual characteristics. So we can then add in 2 more types of task difficulty to our list of potential moderating factors. So difficulty due to auditory interference and difficulty due to nonverbal memory ability. So I then wanted to look at producing gestures. So everything we've looked at so far was just observing a narrator who themselves are gesturing in different ways or not. But what about producing gestures? What about the learner producing gestures themselves? There's some research out there that suggests that the effects of producing gestures are even larger than the effects of observing gestures. So I thought, right, well, let's try that on our narrative comprehension tasks. So in the first study, I combined the gesture observation with production. I wanted to see whether, so here just to replicate, we all love replication in science. So typical, atypical and no gestures again for our gesture observation condition. But I also had a gesture production factor. So they were instructed to produce gestures. They were stopped from producing gestures. So that's our no gesture or restrained gesture condition. Or they were given no instructions about producing gestures, and that's our spontaneous gesture condition. So this was happening during recall. So as before, the gesture observation manipulation was happening during encoding. So while they're watching the videos, but the gesture production manipulation is happening at recall. So they first watched the video and then they recalled it. And while they recalled it, they were either instructed to produce gestures, they were stopped from producing gestures they were told either to sit on their hands or place their hands behind their back, whatever they found most comfortable, just whatever was going to stop them producing gestures, or they were told nothing about producing gestures. So we had a 3x3 design here. So here again, we've got our recall of our gesture questions. So same recall approach that we had for our previous studies, free recall followed by specific questions. We found that overall, the typical gestures were beneficial. So we've got a main effect of gesture observation condition. So this is replicating what I'd found before. Typical gestures were better than both atypical and no gestures. But there was no effect of gesture production and there was no interaction. So that was mildly annoying. But I had a bee in my bonnet about this because I had got effects of gesture production way, way back at the dawn of time. Back when I was an honours student. So look at the date of this one. This is very, very old research. My very first gesture research was when I was an honours student, and I then put it away for a very long time as I went into the deep, dark world of category learning and induction, and then eventually made my way out of that and back to gesture again. But this was my first study, and I had found an effective gesture production back when I was a student myself. I worked with primary school children. I asked them to recall emotionally laden autobiographical memories. So they recalled a time when they were happy and a time when they were scared. And I had the 3 between subjects conditions here of asking them to gesture as they did so, stopping them from gesturing. They put their hands in the pockets of a special memory apron, so they couldn't move their hands, and spontaneous gesture where they weren't told anything about the gestures. I found there was no difference in the total amount of information they recalled, but the no gesture condition actually outperformed the instructed gesture condition on a measure of lexical diversity. So lexical diversity is the number of different words they use. So for example, per 100 words, how much different information is there? Okay, rather than the total amount of information recalled. And the no gesture condition actually outperformed the instructed gesture condition. So I had this in despite the findings that we saw back here of no effect of gesture production, I had in my head, but I have found this before. And like I said before, there is some research to show that producing gestures can have bigger effects than observing gestures. So I put a maybe here. The producing gestures, I thought, is it about the timing of the instructions to produce the gestures? Is there a difference between if you're instructed to produce a gesture during encoding versus recall? We've got some unclear effects here for gesture production during recall for both novel narratives, and autobiographical narratives. So that was my children happy scared study. But think about all the gesture observation studies that I presented in the first half of this talk. They all had the gesture manipulation occurring during encoding. So while they were watching the narrative, while they were learning. Whereas the 2 gesture production studies I've just showed you had the gestures being produced at recall. So while they are relaying what they learnt or what they remembered, not while they were learning it. So maybe the issue there is the timing of the instructions to gesture. So next study, we had no video stimulus here. They read aloud a written narrative. The picture of Pluto is just because we decided to move on from Donald Duck at this point, and we looked at Pluto. So they read aloud a written narrative. So we basically transcribed what happened in a short cartoon scene, and they read that out loud. Same 3 between subjects condition, but they were asked to perform gestures as they read it aloud, or they were prevented from performing gestures as they read it aloud, or they were given no instructions regarding gesture production. We still were interested in individual differences though. So we tested them for verbal memory and for non-verbal memory again. So we've got the Ray auditory verbal learning task and the same Ray complex figure task that I talked about before. We didn't get any effects for free recall. But for the specific question, so again, same recall approach here, we've got an interaction here between verbal memory and our gesture condition. So at 1 standard deviation below the mean, so people who are low on verbal memory, there are no differences between our conditions. At the mean, there's also no difference between our conditions. But for 1 standard deviation above the mean, we found that the instructed and spontaneous gesture conditions did better than the no gesture condition. And we got a similar pattern for delayed verbal memory. So this shows there was an effect of the gesturing, either instructed or spontaneous. Okay, so overall, was there an effect of the gesturing? Yes, there was. If you were told to gesture or you were simply not stopped from gesturing, you did better. If you were stopped from gesturing, it was detrimental. But remember what we started talking about with the gesture observation studies. We started by breaking it down by different type of gesture, iconic, deictic, and I wanted to do that here as well. We wanted to delve deeper into, to mirror that research on observing gestures and look at whether there were differences in the types of gestures produced. So what we did was we coded the gestures that they produced at encoding and we matched them up to recall of those same specific points at test. So we coded whether the participants themselves, we didn't tell them what type of gestures to produce. we coded whether they produced beat gestures, deictic gestures, or we combined our iconic and metaphoric gestures just as representational gestures because so few metaphoric gestures were produced. We got a positive effect of representational gestures. So if they produced like an iconic gesture, for example, they were more likely to remember that point than if they didn't. We got a negative effect of deictic gestures, though. If they pointed while they were learning, while they were reading out loud, they actually were less likely to recall that point. And we got no effect of beat gestures. But, and there's an important caveat here, we got very, very few deictic gestures produced. So was this negative effect simply because we had very few of them produced, only a few participants produced them, and they happened to recall worse? Okay, so hold that thought. We can add gesture type to our potential moderating factor for producing gestures as well. And we got our interaction with verbal memory, so we can also add task difficulty due to verbal memory ability to our list of potential moderating factors. Okay, so what about those deictic gestures, though? We wanted to try and elicit more deictic gestures to see if this was just a fluke by the fact that so few deictic gestures were produced. So we changed our narrative to be a sort of, it was a spatial narrative. We had a story about a snail who was making its way to school. And so there were route directions, there were words like left and right and so on in the narrative. And so we had our same three conditions of instructed gesture, no gesture, and spontaneous gesture. But because we wanted to elicit the deictic gestures specifically, we told them when to gesture. So we bolded certain words in the narrative to try and elicit gestures. So for example, we bolded the phrase that he went to his left to try and get participants to point left. Other phrases were designed to elicit iconic gestures. So for example, he grabbed his snowboard. We were trying to get them to do an iconic gesture of grabbing. And we also had some individual difference measures, the verbal memory again with the Ray auditory verbal learning test. And because this was a spatial narrative, we also tested spatial ability with the Santa Barbara sense of direction scale. So what we found was that for free recall, the spontaneous condition did better than the instructed gesture condition. This telling them when to gesture and bolding the points was causing a problem for them. For the specific gesture questions, we found that the instructed and the spontaneous did better than the no gestures though. So for those particular points, it actually was beneficial. Okay, so overall, spontaneous was better than instructed, but for those specific questions, for those specific parts of the narrative where they were told to gesture, instructed and spontaneous did better than no gesture. And we got a positive effect of iconic gestures, so that mirrors the previous study. We got a positive effect of deictic gestures, and we got no effect of beat gestures. So that was reassuring that our negative effect of deictic gestures from the previous study probably was just a fluke based on how few of them were produced. We got a weird interaction for non-gesture phrases when those were recalled. Participants so at one standard deviation above the mean, the spontaneous condition outperformed our no gesture and instructed gesture conditions. But we got no interactive effects with spatial ability. So we can add no effects of spatial ability to our list here of potential moderating factors. Now, if I'd been giving this talk 2 weeks ago, this is where it would have ended. But you'll just have to bear with me for a couple more minutes because I just had a paper accepted last week that I want to tell you about. So, still impressed because yes, like I said, only accepted last week. I wanted to look further into this telling people when to gesture because as you saw, we had some weird results from that previous study. Sometimes it's beneficial, sometimes it was detrimental. That's a little bit weird. I wanted to look a bit further into this. So we've got 2 studies in this paper, 2 between subjects conditions. Participants were either instructed to produce gestures, but they were not told when to gesture, because as we saw, that caused some problems, or spontaneous gesture. We took out the no gesture condition based on ecological validity reasons. Stopping people gesturing is probably not very realistic for the real world. When does that actually happen? We then manipulated task difficulty by emotional valence. So emotional stimuli are easier for us to remember than non-emotional stimuli. And within that, negative stimuli are easier for us to remember than positive stimuli. So we had three narratives: a positive narrative, a negative narrative, and a neutral narrative. These were stories about a high school student receiving her letter to say whether she'd got into university or not. Okay, in the positive narrative, she gets into university. In the negative narrative, she doesn't. And the whole story is about how nervous and stressed she's feeling. And in the neutral narrative, she kind of doesn't care. And in the end, we don't find out whether she gets in. It's just very neutral. In the first study, we measured verbal memory. And in the second study, we still measured verbal memory, but we also measured propensity to gesture. So we've got some weird results with the instructions to gesture, right? Maybe if you instruct someone to gesture who themselves would never normally gesture, that's when the problems arise. Maybe if you instruct people to gesture who are quite happy gesturing, maybe it's helpful for them, but for the people who typically would not gesture, maybe that's where the problems are arising. So second study, we were looking at propensity to gesture as well. So study one, we've got free recall over here, and we've got our specific recall over here. So specific recall here was just individual questions, but not specifically of gesture points, because remember, they produced gestures whenever they wanted. So it's not of any specific points in the narrative. It was of specific points, but not matched up to the gestures. They were just individual questions. Okay, so free recall and then just a series of separate questions. Both verbal memory and emotional valence positively predicted recall. But the interesting part here is that the instruction to gesture, so that's our solid black line, was detrimental to recall, but not for those low in verbal memory. So we've got the association here between verbal memory and recall, where as verbal memory increased, recall increased. We've got what you'd expect for the spontaneous gesture condition. People with high verbal memory remembered more. But when we instructed them to gesture, that was a problem, but only for people high in verbal memory. The people low in verbal memory, instructing them to gesture made no difference. Okay, so for people high in verbal memory, instructing them to gesture was detrimental. So we tried to replicate this, and because it was quite an unexpected finding. And we also wanted to add in, like I said before, the propensity to gesture measure. We found that the instructions to gesture were detrimental again. So we replicated that part of it, but only for those with low or average propensity to gesture. So people who didn't gesture much, telling them to gesture was a problem. And also for the neutral narratives. So remember I said before that we remember positive and negative narratives, or sorry, not narratives necessarily, but content. We remember positive and negative content better anyway. Yeah, that happened. And the instruction to gesture made no difference. But for the neutral narrative, where it's perhaps less memorable, instructing them to gesture was detrimental. Okay, so the instruction to gesture was detrimental for those who were low or average on propensity to gesture, and for the neutral narratives. Interestingly, the interaction from study one with verbal memory was not replicated. So for the moment, this is where the story ends, and I need to continue this further, but that's just a little bit of a taster of where my research program is going from here. I need to follow this up because we've got some really weird results now with gesture production. But what that means is that we can add task difficulty due to emotional valence to our list of potential moderators. So yes, for a neutral narrative, the instruction to gesture makes a difference, but for the positive and neutral, it didn't. And also task difficulty due to propensity to gesture. So for those who were lower or average on propensity to gesture, the instruction to gesture was actually detrimental. So in summary, for observing gestures, we found that yes, gesture type, so that's our iconic, deictic, beat, moderated the extent to which the gestures were beneficial, as did the typicality of the iconic gestures, the task type, as well as our individual differences. And we got the same thing with producing gestures, gesture type, task type, and individual differences, but also perhaps the details around when the gestures were produced has also made a difference. Now, the gesture production stuff is much more new to me, so there's still much less of a coherent story there about when it is or isn't beneficial. And so that's what's next on my list to continue studying. And I'd just like to thank all of my wonderful collaborators here, some of whom are my students, some of whom are not my students. And yeah, thank you for listening.